Welcome to week 9 of the course Introduction to Neurodiversity. In this module, we'll be looking on the sunny side of social and emotional disorders. The two books that we're using for this course are my two books on neurodiversity. The first one is The Power of Neurodiversity, Unleashing the Advantages of Your Differently Wired Brain, and that's focused mostly on adult neurodiversity. And my book, Neurodiversity in the Classroom, Strength-Based Strategies to Help Students with Special Needs Succeed in School and Life. And that book is more applicable to kindergarten through 12th grade education. First of all, I'd like you to do a little reflection. I'd like you to think of someone in your life, either now or in the past, who's had a social and/or an emotional disorder. Maybe it was depression or bipolar or an anxiety disorder like OCD or even schizophrenia. And just notice that person and pay attention to how his or her life has been affected by that social and or emotional disorder. Do they have positive niche construction in their life? Or instead, was there a lot of negative niche construction? When I talk in this lecture about social and emotional disorders, that takes in a lot of territory. And so I'm going to be skipping back and forth between different disorders as I talk, rather than taking each disorder in turn, which would of course take a long time since the DSM-5 has hundreds of them. But I am going to focus mainly on depression, bipolar disorder, OCD, anxiety disorders in general, and schizophrenia. I'm showing this image of multiple intelligences just to point out that when we are talking about social and emotional disorders, the two intelligences that come up both for strengths and for weaknesses are what Gardner called the personal intelligences, people smart and self-smart. Individuals may well show intelligences in other areas, but these two intelligences seem to take center stage in any discussion of social and emotional disorders. I'm going to be using the same 7-part component structure of positive niche construction. So we'll begin with strength awareness. What are some of the strengths associated with social and emotional disorders? First of all, there are emotional sensitivities. This is a double-edged sword. It can really cut both ways. It can be a real negative in terms of picking up on emotional currents from other people, from situations, from culture in general. But it can also be a positive, having the sensitivity to appreciate fine music, to appreciate the beauty in nature, and so forth. And so we have to concede that there are positive aspects and negative aspects. And it may turn out to be that whether or not the positive or negative will predominate has something to do with the positive niche construction that is done on behalf of the individual. I like to point to other cultures, traditions, and historical eras frequently throughout this course. And in this case, I just want to bring up the role of the shaman, who in our current world would probably find himself somewhere in the DSM-5, very much probably in the psychosis section, because they do not reason in the way that Western logic implies. They pick up on things that others neglect. They if we think that many of us or most of us have a filter system that keeps a lot of material from coming into our brains, these individuals are more open to what's coming in. And they use that knowledge for healing, for helping the culture that they're in. In fact, Joseph Campbell says that it's frequently an adolescent who manifests signs that in Western culture would be regarded as psychotic or schizophrenic, and they're taken aside and worked with by the local shaman, sometimes for many years, until the time when they become themselves shaman. Another strength is creative abilities. I'm going to talk here about bipolar disorder. A study was done at Stanford University that basically used what's called the Welsh Art Scales, and it's sort of a forced choice evaluation. The subject is presented with two drawings, and they're asked to say which is more interesting. And it turns out that kids who had bipolar disorder or parents with bipolar disorder did better on this measure than did typically developing individuals. I also want to call your attention to a book, Touched with Fire, Manic Depressive Illness and the Artistic Temperament by Kay Redfield Jamison. She's a psychiatrist who herself has bipolar disorder, and she looks at all of the connections between artists of different kinds, musicians, writers, painters, and so forth, and how many of them had bipolar disorder, how there seems to be a greater incidence of bipolar disorder in the humanities, actually, than in the sciences, or in politics, or in exploration. Another strength is high energy levels. And here again, I'm going to talk about the manic phase of bipolar disorder. Many people with bipolar disorder, including Kay Redfield Jamison, often say that if they could only have the manic phase of their disorder, they would not want to give it up. But that the despair of the depressive stage really leads them to want to be free of the disorder. But in the manic stage, people are incredibly suffused with energy. They may work for hours and days at a time without little rest. They maybe have projects galore that they're building in their mind. Their mind is very active and alive. And of course, this is perceived by many people with bipolar as a positive. And if we think about it in terms of other cultures or other times, we can see how there might be a genetic advantage to the manic phase of bipolar disorder. Another aspect of the mania phase is increased sexuality. And you can see that individuals with who are higher sexed individuals will procreate more often and therefore pass on their genes. They will also have more energy than anybody else and be able to build huts and hunt and gather more than their share, and in that way also contribute to the survival of the culture that they're in. Another dimension which relates to the depressive aspect of bipolar disorder and to unipolar disorder is the ruminative capabilities. Now, what is rumination? We have the Thinker by Rodin illustrated. Rumination is the process of mind chatter, essentially. It's what we say to ourselves constantly. If you're familiar with mindfulness training, it's the part of the brain called the default mode network that is constantly comparing, looking in the past, planning for the future, making comparisons, saying if I'd only done this, I should have done that. But on the other hand, And this is something that I have intimate connection with since I have unipolar disorder and I ruminate a lot. And when I'm in the depressive stages of this disorder, I cannot control the negative thoughts that go through my mind. It's just a complete downer. But like emotional sensitivity, rumination has a positive side and a negative side. The positive side is that it helps me as a writer because before I write and as I'm writing, there is a little voice inside me saying, put this idea next, or hey, this is a great idea, or you want to look at what you just said here and make sure that it works with what you're going to say. And you know, lots of ideas. It's just rumination city going on when I'm writing. And the fact that many writers do have either bipolar disorder or unipolar depression seems to lend credence to the idea that rumination can be a help. I sometimes like to point to one of my favorite writers, David Foster Wallace, whose brilliant book, Infinite Jest, if you haven't read, you should go out and get it. I should warn you that it's about 12,000 pages. Excuse me, not that many. That sounds like the Mahabharata. 1,200 pages. See, now it sounds easier and you're going to go out and get it. And it's got footnotes. It's got 100 more pages of footnotes. And it's even got footnotes on the footnotes. And if you hear him speak in a YouTube video, you can see him almost ruminating out loud. And he did suffer from severe unipolar depression and unfortunately took his own life in his mid-40s. Another sort of indirect advantage, and this is going to be dealing with schizophrenia, has to do with genetic advantages to relatives of the individual afflicted. It's interesting to note that 3 of the individuals who have had the greatest impact on Western civilization in the 20th century, Albert Einstein, James Joyce, and James Watson, the discoverer of DNA, co-discoverer of DNA, all had kids, either daughters or sons, with schizophrenia. And it's been suggested that having schizophrenia itself is not a good deal for anybody, that it causes havoc in one's executive functioning, that the distinctions between objective and subjective worlds gets significantly confused, that auditory hallucinations in particular, where one perceives that others are talking about them, afflict one's days. I have a friend who has schizophrenia and he continually believes that there's people in the attic saying things about him. And, you know, I kind of want to say, why don't you just go up in the attic and check? But that sort of gets, you know, is beside the point because he might well transfer it to another locus in that case. But it's been suggested that having a certain number of genes for schizophrenia actually predisposes a person to high levels of achievement. But having all of the genes for schizophrenia makes it really a negative. Consequently, if we look at the gene pool of familial groups, we can see that certain individuals had advantages, and unfortunately, other individuals had to pay the price for those advantages. Another strength, and this is another one that's a little bit hard to explain, and this relates to depression, is that there seems to be among depressed people a deeper cast of mind. In the medieval worldview, there were 4 temperaments: the sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic. And the melancholic obviously was associated with what we would now call depression. But melancholia was not totally thought of as a negative. Saturn was seen to be the ruler of melancholia, both astrologically and in terms of mythology. And The thought was that Saturn gave one a more sober assessment of life, that it deepened one's outlook on life. Saturn is the god of time, and people with depression often are incredibly taken up with the passage of time and the sweetness of each moment and the heartache that goes with the fading of the bloom on the rose, so to speak. And so here we have a more complex, I think, vision of depression that doesn't simply look at it as a disorder, but rather as a cast of mind that perhaps one can say one lives life more thoroughly, more deeply, if one has this aspect to one's personality. I also want to talk about depression with this next strength. And this is a concept that comes from a psychoanalyst named Emmy Gutt, G-U-T. And she makes a distinction between productive depressions and non-productive depressions. And this is interesting, and I think there needs to be more attention focused on it. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, broke off from his teacher, Sigmund Freud, in his late 30s due to a number of reasons, among which Jung felt there was not enough focus on spirituality. There wasn't any focus on spirituality in Freud except to pathologize it. And so Jung broke away and became depressed. And it was really a difficult time for him in his life. And he said that one day he had a dream that reminded him of how he used to play as a child next to Lake Zurich and build little dams and buildings and little towns. And so, he was very keen on dreams, and he took the cue from the dream. And after his medical practice was over during lunchtime, he would go out to Lake Zurich because his house was on Lake Zurich. And he went out and he began to play again as a child. And he said that this process of playing filled him with new ideas and in fact was transformative to his creative life for the rest of his life. And so we see here, I think, an example of what Emmy Gutt would call a productive depression, a depression that led to a transformation versus a non-productive depression that seems to lead to a diminishment of life, perhaps increased illness, physical and or mental, and even death. Another strength related to social and emotional disorders is having a more realistic appraisal of life. This can be associated with the Saturnian mind that I just talked about, but it also relates to the topic of anxiety disorders. And because I point out in my book, The Power of Neurodiversity, how certain studies have revealed that individuals with anxiety disorders have fewer accidents than typically developing individuals. They have caution built into their wiring, and so they're more apt to be careful when they're out driving or careful when they're doing anything. And so having an anxiety disorder, as uncomfortable as it is, and I also have an anxiety disorder and have gone through horrible anxiety in my life. And I know that this is, something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, still has this positive aspect of caution. I'm not going to put all my money in growth stocks in the stock market, for example, and hopefully that will pay off in the long run. But I want to look back at other times and places to see the genetic advantages of having an anxiety disorder. Obviously, a person with anxiety disorder is not going to come right up to a mastodon or up to a prey and tickle its chin. It's going to be wary. And the wariness is going to help preserve their life so they survive and they pass on their genes. I'm also going to talk about OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, a disorder where people have to do rituals, where they have to wash their hands 16 times before they can go outside, or where they, um, have to go back to their home many, many times to make sure that they lock the door. In my book, The Power of Neurodiversity, I indicate some of the brain issues connected with OCD. And I also talk about how OCD might have been an advantage in cultures that had very complex religious rituals. Back in the day, in many cultures, in Hebrew cultures, in Indian cultures, in North India and so forth, the idea of sacrificing cattle was a very big deal at one time. And the sacrifice had to be done exactly as prescribed and had to be followed letter by letter, word by word, formula by formula. And if any part of the ritual was missing or in error, the ritual had to be repeated. And I think you can appreciate how an individual, excuse me, an individual who's donated 200 of his cattle to the latest sacrifice will be sorely disappointed if they have to sacrifice another 200 cattle simply because the priest forgot or misread or switched the wrong formula for a ritual. And how, in such a situation, people with OCD who are very careful about ritual and about doing it correctly would be an advantage in that culture. Let's go on to look at positive role models related to social and emotional disorders. And this really could take us in many directions. While in the area of intellectual disabilities and autism, we seem to have fewer role models to look to. It's really interesting how we could probably name hundreds, if not thousands, of famous individuals who struggled with emotional disorders. So I'm just going to give 4 of them here. Beethoven, in the book The Power of Neurodiversity, I talk about how he almost killed himself, partly because of his losing his hearing, partly because of a failed love affair. And he didn't kill himself. And he said, the reason was I wanted to see if there was more that I could give to humanity through my music. This would probably be another good example of a productive depression that he went through. Abraham Lincoln struggled with depression. You might have noted in the book where I talked about his niche construction, where he would recite by himself these sad poems and ballads and laments. And that was a way for him to deal with and surmount the pain that he was going through. And I should add, I don't think I put this in either of my books on neurodiversity. Perhaps I did, but 25% of our US presidents have struggled with emotional problems. Now the figure is probably a little bit higher. Another role model would be Nikola Tesla, who also struggled with depression, with bipolar disorder, possibly even with psychoses. In fact, this is a great picture. It almost seems like a picture of his mind flaming away. This is the Tesla generator, the Tesla coil that he developed. Vincent van Gogh, or Van Gogh, as the case may be, of course, struggled with mental illness throughout his brief life, which was ended by suicide, but gave birth to incredible beauty. John Nash, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist and mathematician, was afflicted with schizophrenia. And of course, they made a wonderful film about his life called A Brilliant Mind, based upon a biography of his life. And then I thought I should also put someone from the entertainment industry in this list. This would be take us hours and hours to go through all the people in the entertainment industry and Hollywood and so forth who struggled with emotional disorders. To be able to act requires calling upon one's emotional flexibility, to be able to act like one person one moment and another person at another moment, to be able to shift emotions requires a certain amount of emotional lability. And that's a positive when it comes to acting, but a negative when it comes to living. And Judy Garland suffered with substance abuse, among other disabilities throughout her life. And unfortunately, her life ended all too soon as well. Some assistive technologies and universal design for learning tools. Biofeedback is one technology that has helped individuals calm their mind down and relax. This particular app for the iPhone includes sensors that attach to the fingertips and measures galvanic skin response, which is the amount of moisture that one produces in one's fingers and how much electricity is able to conduct itself more quickly through water than not with water. Thus, you have an accurate readout of your, I guess, of your sweatiness, your nervousness. Another app that would be appropriate here is a mood tracker. There are a number of mood trackers out there which allow individuals to kind of track when they're feeling happy, when they're feeling upset, when they're feeling angry, being able to identify their emotions, which itself is a form of emotional intelligence that can help individuals with these disorders. Another app that's been advertised a lot on TV lately is Calm, which is a mindfulness app, which leads you through a meditation to pay attention to your breathing and to note any interruptions, any sensations, any emotions or ideas, and then simply go back to your breathing. And for PTSD, I haven't mentioned PTSD in this lecture, but a promising area of technology is the use of virtual reality in training individuals to desensitize themselves from situations that seem to trigger their memories of being in the war or being in the military in some fashion. A few strength-based learning strategies. I would have to say the expressive arts should be a key avenue through which to educate individuals with social and emotional disorders, because it provides a positive channel for their discombobulated energies and emotions. And this can be built into the curriculum in lots of different ways, by drawing pictures of stories or concepts or anything at all that one is studying, or doing it through music, creating new music, or dance, or other ways, writing, creative writing. And as pertains creative writing, I think a separate strength-based strategy would be journal writing. One could use this, especially if one had gifts in the area of writing, to explore their life, their personal emotions, the ups and downs of their day, their plans for the future, things that confuse them, things that inspire them, that this should be used much more often in school than it is currently. Bibliotherapy or books on social and emotional themes can be another strength-based strategy, especially for individuals who love to read. And so you just have here a number of books that, a small fraction of the number of books that are out now that have come out in the last just few years on social and emotional themes to help individuals cope. I also include projects and project-based learning as a strategy, because projects often take the somewhat chaotic energies of a person who's going through an emotional crisis and channels it in a productive direction and focuses their attention and their mood in a safe and a creative way. Now let's look at enhanced human resource networks. I think one key person in the life of an individual with a social or emotional disorder is a therapist. For young children, this could be a play therapist. For older individuals, it could be a psychoanalyst or a psychiatrist or a psychologist. Any kind of therapist who can help one deal with the emotional struggles that one is going through can be a very positive addition to one's social network, in human resource network, excuse me. Group therapy could also qualify, or something called self-determination skills. This is a seminar in self-determination skills for high school students, where they learn specific strategies to help them with their emotional issues, especially when they reach the workplace. Some of the skills that are involved in self-determination include being able to identify one's strengths and weaknesses, being able to work with a job coach, being able to deal with specific problems that might arise on the job, to be able to anticipate them and work out strategies for overcoming them, and so forth. Another part of a human resource network for an individual with social and or emotional disorders would be a mentor for a Big Brother program or a Big Sister program, or a program that matches a college student with a younger student. Somebody who themselves may have struggled and overcome emotional difficulties and give them strength and support so that they too can do that, or who themselves are in very good emotional, in a very good emotional place and can be a role model that they can follow. Also, what's called wraparound services would be, I think, a plus to any human resource network. Wraparound services refers to the coordination for an individual with social or emotional disorders, the coordination of efforts between the teacher, the special ed teacher, the therapist, the social worker, perhaps the psychologist, and other individuals who are working in the school environment or the community to help support that individual in different ways. Affirmative career aspirations. Since the arts seem to figure so hugely in the life of many of these individuals, pursuing some kind of career in art or music or dance or some other creative, expressive avenue could be one way to go. And this doesn't mean, somebody says, well, we can't all be artists. No, but if anybody can, it's oftentimes individuals with social and emotional disorder. Being a therapist or a counselor can be a good avenue for a career. People will say, well, how can they be, a therapist or a counselor if they have problems? And it seems to be that individuals who themselves dealt with problems are often the best ones to help other people navigate their way through them, especially if the individual involved has made progress in their own journey through emotional turbulence. And the process of training counselors and therapists and psychologists often provides a wonderful niche, I guess I would have to say, for supporting emotional and social growth. In the religious field, being a minister or a priest or a chaplain might be a way that one can minister to the needs of others in a spiritual way, because I haven't mentioned spirituality except indirectly when I talked about the shaman, but I think that people with social and emotional disorders often bring a certain amount of spirituality with them into their lives. They're often driven to it through despair, and finding something that transcends them to help them through their experiences then qualifies them to do the same in helping others. And then being a writer, I'd mentioned earlier how the ruminations of writers, which is a negative when one is in a depressive episode, can be a positive when one is writing a book, writing articles, being a journalist for a newspaper, and so forth. And finally, let's look at some positive environmental modifications. In the classroom, having a place where a child can go when they feel emotionally confused, when they feel like they're about to throw a tantrum or act out in some way, having a place they can go to, what Jane Nelson calls a positive timeout, which is chosen by the child, not by the teacher. We're not talking about go to your corner and think about what you did, but rather, what do you think? You think you need a break right now? We all need a break at some point. The teacher needs a break. The teacher should have their own positive timeout center, a place where they can get away and regroup and regather their forces so that they can go back into the classroom with new energy, new focus, and new resolve. Many schools now, through the mindfulness movement, are beginning to create entire rooms dedicated to getting themselves together, sometimes called chill out rooms or mindfulness rooms, that contain mats for yoga and pillows for mindfulness meditation, perhaps soft music, and a human being there who can talk with an individual about whatever is troubling. Programs that involve nature in any way, I think, would also be an important modification. I show here an example of the Outward Bound program, where kids or college students go out into the wild and support each other. And we know many programs that have done this with conduct disordered individuals, particularly kids in adolescence. But even lesser amounts of nature can be highly therapeutic for individuals who are going through emotional difficulties. And then I mentioned project-based learning earlier, so having a maker space in the school where individuals can create contraptions, inventions, gizmos, gadgets based upon their own creativity can be an important addition to the structure of the school environment. Lastly, I'd like you to close your eyes if you would. Don't do this if you're driving. Visualize a setting which illustrates how you'd like to implement positive niche construction for a particular child, teen, or adult who's been diagnosed with a social and/or emotional disorder. What particular aspects of positive niche construction would you give to this individual? How would that improve their lives? And what more could you do to make sure that they have the most optimal learning environment possible? Next week will be our last week, and the lecture for that week will be essentially a kind of a summing up of where we've been. But I want to have us look at both ends of the telescope, so to speak, at both the macro or big picture related to neurodiversity and the micro dimensions. In other words, how can we make specific change in the classroom in particular happen, given the rigidities of the system, the kinds of resistances or inertia that has accompanied special education over the years. So anyway, I hope you have a great week and good luck, and thanks for listening. For further information, get my 2 books on neurodiversity. First of all, the power of neurodiversity, unleashing the advantages of your differently wired brain, and neurodiversity in the classroom, strength-based strategies to help students with special needs succeed in school and life.